My name is Mark Lee, Chairman of Cityforum. I'm pleased to introduce this podcast today, which is part of Cityforum's Intelligent Defence and Smart Power projects, conducted with the guidance of the Ministry of Defence and senior officers in it, and with the sponsorship support of BAE Systems Applied Intelligence, without whom it would be impossible to organise this series at all. This part of our work in 2020 looks at global Britain, and in particular at global Britain in a world that is polarising, where there are more and more problems in the grey zone, and where the rivalries of countries active on the other side in the grey zone are becoming more and more potent, and COVID-19 makes the situation worse. We have a podcast today with three very authoritative figures who will be discussing both of our principal opponents in the grey zone, Russia and China, and looking at their motivations and their activities, which are different, although they often work together. The session today is opened by Professor Anthony Cordesman, the senior figure from the CSIS think tank, a very respected organisation in Washington DC, who is always particularly fascinating on the interpretation of official Washington. And official Washington matters a great deal to the United Kingdom. Isabel Hilton, CEO of the China Dialogue Trust, who is an old friend of Cityforum, will be giving a view on China in particular. She's made a number of exceptional contributions to our roundtables, and we look forward to her words today. Then we have David Shimer, author of a new book published by Penguin Random House, Rigged, which looks at the whole relationship between the US and Russia in terms of electoral interference. And he, as a student of Russia, will give us an interesting view on what motivates Russia today and what we may expect of the Russians in competition with us in all the areas of grey zone conflict. The conversation is to be chaired by General Sir Jack Deverell, Cityforum Senior Military Associate, who will guide the discussion and, after half an hour or so, bring it to a conclusion. At that point, we shall hand over to Lady Pauline Neville-Jones, former Minister of Security, with a lifelong experience in diplomacy and in the pursuit of foreign policy objectives, who will give her conclusions on what we may expect of Russia and China in the years ahead, and what global Britain would be in a position to do to contribute to Western assessment and action. Jack.
Let's start the ball rolling, if we may, and I would like to ask Anthony Cordesman if he would like to deliver his piece.
Thanks very much. I think it's rather striking that we're talking about competition with China and Russia today. Yesterday, Secretary Pompeo delivered a speech at the Nixon Center, which was the fourth major speech, basically declaring that the U.S. faced a major threat from China, that China had violated both economic and security relationships, that cooperation was now far more difficult. This followed on a speech from the director of the FBI, a national security advisor's speech, and a speech by the Attorney General. It did not get much attention because of the closing of the consulate in Houston and other events, but it is a radical shift in the way the administration has approached China and indirectly Russia. Now, this is not really all that new. In 2017, we declared a new national strategy, which talked about Russia and China as our major competitors and, put simply, threats. In 2018, we declared this as a defense strategy in more depth. And to put it in context, the competition has become much more clear over the course of the last few years, and even over the last day, you saw some interesting developments. Russia conducted an anti-satellite test in space. This is part of programs that both Russia and China have accelerated. The commander of our Pacific Command met with the Secretary of Defense and asked for $20 billion more for both missile defense and long-range precision strike capabilities with conventional missiles. Now, that doesn't mean we have a national consensus. I think American experts, people in the intelligence community, people in the academic world, all tend to have different views and different approaches to this issue. And some are focused on ideology, some on strategy, some on civil issues like trade. There is no whole of government in the sense that there is a coordinated picture of what the U.S. is doing, and there's even less coordination when it comes to relationships with our allies. And very often, when it comes down to what China and Russia are doing, there's very little attention to their actual military intelligence and other activities. People talk about white papers and strategy, and quite frankly, neither country has a level of military intelligence or in a lot of ways economic activity which really tracks all that well with what they say. Now, there are some clear patterns. One is that China is moving towards a point, as yet difficult to determine, where it might have parity in many aspects of a defense industrial base and military technology and forces with the U.S., at least in Asia. There are discussions that it is issued about goals like 2030 or 2050. None of these as yet have enough data in the open source world to really place where China is. Russia basically has not really recovered from the breakup of the former Soviet Union. It's not had the economic progress. To a great degree, it's living off the past in terms of its defense structure and industrial base, but it is modernizing. When you look at economic power, most people would argue that China probably leads the U.S. if you use a measurement like purchasing power parity. The U.S. leads in market terms. But if you use the World Bank's comparisons for GNI, which is really the modern part of the economy, that's a very different story because the U.S. is rated at 18.8 trillion, China at 10.8, and Russia at 1.7. Those are radically different figures, and which parameter you choose is a matter of who chooses by expert. I think what you do see is that China has emerged as a major industrial or manufacturing power. And there, arguably, by some metrics, it now is leading the United States. It certainly is in terms of international trade. But there is almost no meaningful unclassified analysis of the comparative defense industrial base and output of the U.S., China, and Russia. The figures I've seen basically don't have clear sources. The closest I've seen to something that's credible is an exercise by RAND, but it's only a very broad comparison. So one key question for all of us is, what is the level of economic competition? How quickly will China, if it does, equal the U.S.? And equal the U.S. in what? Defense industry, manufacturing, economic output. These are issues where the more you look at the data, the more uncertain and the different the comparisons get. The issue is very different in terms of military security. Transparency is limited in a lot of critical areas. These include some of the most advanced technologies. Most of the data in the unclassified domain on missiles only really considers range, not accuracy, reliability, or payload. The data on modernization of weaponry often simply talks about generations of aircraft, not performance. Shifts in China to greatly modernize its forces have led to major cuts in the force levels and to massive improvements in force quality. So the tendency to rate military forces by total military manpower is totally misleading. But when you come down to other areas, multi-domain warfare, cyber warfare, information warfare, an awful lot of that remains highly classified, and much of the data that you see in open sources is both speculative and, quite frankly, often pretty clearly wrong. Again, there are some exceptions in terms of quality. I think you have the Chinese military power document from Janes. You have a similar document from DIA, which is perhaps the best source. There's work by RAND, the IISS, groups like RUSI. But I think we really need to understand that this work is not comparable. So when you talk about competition, you really don't have data which allows you to easily compare the overall efforts in gray area, hybrid warfare, or in deterrence and regular warfare between China, Russia, and the United States. What you do know is that there's been a massive shift in resources. China was rated as having less than 50 billion in constant 2018 dollars in military spending from about 1990 to 2000. It rapidly rose to about 100 billion in 2007, and it's somewhere over 250 billion today. Experts argue over this, but those are figures I took from CIPRI, and they're relatively conservative. The U.S. has gone from around 600 billion in 2000, 450 billion before the wars became peaked with Iraq and Afghanistan, and now is around 720 billion. There are arguments over Russia, but most open sources put them at around 57 to 60 billion. That's a fifth of China and way under a tenth of the United States. Force modernization comparisons show that China is making major improvements. Russia's made a surprisingly high number for a country with its economic problems, but it is certainly not competitive in direct terms with the United States and with China. Again, I have to stress the uncertainties in a lot of these comparisons. And in some areas, there's a real issue as to what are you looking at. Hybrid warfare says essentially you're using military force demonstratively rather than in any kind of conflict. The problem is you're also using, in China's case and Russia, economics. And economic relations, like the Belt and Road relationship, have in general a strategic dimension. You can't separate the two. You have the use of third country forces and volunteers. And often the sources and the level of involvement by Russia or China is not that clear. When you look at theater competition, trying to compare Russia, China, South Korea, and Japan is by itself almost a separate discipline, although their white papers help. And I think one thing that I have to say when I'm dealing with the European audience is NATO basically has failed almost completely to describe any area of this competition in meaningful terms. There is no correlation between spending 2% of the GDP in any aspect of military modernization and capability. The same as the 20% procurement. What should be a net assessment of trends in forces is basically an economic exercise in burden sharing. And it is one which, if you look at it, raises some interesting questions because for all the talk about Europe spent $284 billion on military forces in 2019, and officially Russia spent less than 60. When you look at those numbers, you have to realize how little we have actually addressed that issue. When it comes down to China, the other side of this is we have major allies and strategic partners. They are not spending vast amounts of money, but Japan, South Korea, Australia, other countries do compete with China. So this is a world in which we are looking at almost every level of military activity, whole of government, gray area, and hybrid warfare, that's seen a radical shift in acceleration of competition, now formally part of U.S. doctrine, at least as of yesterday from the Secretary of State, which doesn't necessarily mean the president won't have his own voice, and where in many areas we know the competition has sharply accelerated, but there are lots of blank spots, key areas. Let me just close with one example. China is rated as having more than doubled its number of nuclear weapons. If you look carefully, none of the estimates indicate why, where those weapons are going to be deployed, what system for deployment they'll be on. It has greatly diversified its potential delivery systems, but many of those delivery systems can be used in the future for precision conventional strike in multi-domain warfare. So the blurring of lines between nuclear and conventional is critical. The same trends have emerged to a lesser degree in Russia. You have many systems emerging which could, in theory, carry low-yield nuclear weapons, or high-yield for that matter, that are described as conventional. The U.S. is, to some extent, matching this, and that could potentially leapfrog the past focus on nuclear weapons. And that's just one example of the theater-by-theater issues we face in competition. I hope my fellow panelists can sort all of this out because, somewhat deliberately, I'm focusing on the fact that we have often some very positive papers being issued in the open source literature, and the actual knowledge of what's going on in the countries involved, shall we say, does not reflect what are often some fairly dramatic conclusions. Thank you.
Anthony, thank you very much indeed. There was a hell of a lot in there, and we will come back at the end to further discuss some of those very important issues. I'd now like to ask Isabel Hilton if she would like to take us through her points.
Thank you very much, and delighted to be joining you. And thank you to Anthony for getting this conversation off to such a rigorous and interesting start. The opening question that I think was the headline for this conversation was, do we understand China enough? I'm not a military strategist, but I do look at China quite closely, and I do look at security. And certainly the answer has to be no. I've been very struck over recent months as tensions have risen with China that we have tended to fall back in the public discussion, at least, on the old tropes of the Cold War. I don't think analogies with the Cold War are necessarily very helpful to us for very obvious reasons. China's the second biggest economy. It's deeply embedded in supply chains. And China has a much more compelling offer, I think, to the developing world than the Soviet Union ever did. It does seem to offer an example of development without strings and assistance with development without strings. There are strings, of course, but they're not as crude and evident as the Soviet strings were. And China has been working the room in the sense of all the UN institutions over the last decade, using its economic muscle, using its economic allure to essentially, secure votes in multilateral fora. So China has consolidated its global diplomatic position. It's consolidated its military posture. It's consolidated its economic role, and in 2013, as we know, launched the Belt and Road as a sort of global move. That hasn't gone terribly well, and I think that I would anticipate that it will go pretty badly in next year and in subsequent years for a number of reasons that we can return to. But just coming back to how we, and I guess I'm speaking as a UK citizen at this point, have understood China for the last 30 years at a political level. We've essentially regarded China as a commercial opportunity. And we really didn't fully understand, I don't think, the compelling power of an industrial policy which is in the service of an ambitious state. We're only just beginning to appreciate the depth and range of the systemic competition. And we've only just begun to appreciate the risks, for example, associated with Chinese involvement in our critical infrastructure, a classic and obvious error, or the risks of Chinese investment in advanced technologies in Europe or in the UK. I don't think we really understood the ambitions of that state, although they have been, fairly well laid out in various leader speeches, which we didn't really take at face value. And to be fair, the ambitions of that state have conspicuously sharpened since 2012. But I think more concerning, and something that we have to look at quite closely, is that our own ideological frameworks have made our response too little and certainly later than it should be. So we've been reducing the power of our own states. We haven't really had industrial policies. We have been proactive in outsourcing of industrial efforts. And as China has moved up the technology value chain, we've only slowly come to understand what the implications might be in the next 5 to 10 years. It's really quite close now. And it has been fairly close if we were watching closely. It's been fairly evident 4 to 5 years ago with the 13th five-year plan what the strategy would be. And we really didn't take it quite as seriously as we should have done. So why have things changed in China? Well, partly where China got to in terms of its own industrial economy and political economy, and a combination of domestic need, the need to establish a powerful narrative in order to maintain power for the party, which is, of course, the parties in the proceedings of the Western system, which begin with the global financial crisis. And then with the election of Donald Trump, the perception that the United States was turning inward, was turning away from global engagement. China saw this as a series of alliances being weakened, and therefore an opportunity for China to exercise not just its economic muscle, but the other muscles that have been in development. And I think that we need to understand better the relationship between China's domestic pressures and its external ambitions, and why national security is now a central driver of Chinese foreign and security policy. I would simply highlight, and I think I'll probably close with this for the time being, what China's domestic narrative is. It's a nationalist narrative. It's a narrative of victimhood and grievance that's been officially embedded as China's national story, and that allows the party to present itself as both the nation's savior and the guardian for the foreseeable future. But it also creates a need to demonstrate the efficacy of these claims. So, for example, as Beijing would put it, the reunification of Taiwan, which one way or another probably needs to be done from the party's point of view by 2049, the centenary of the foundation of the People's Republic, is central to that narrative. But so obviously is the competition with the United States and the return, as China would see it, to regional dominance for China. That involves, as we know, the maritime domain. It involves changing trade and economic patterns, and it involves a much more robust military posture. So this narrative also needs. It also creates a need to control the international story on China, to demonstrate at home that China is widely admired and respected, and to stifle international criticism of China's policy. And that has become one of the central tenets of the civil-military fusion that became the national strategy in 2014. So there are key priorities: building national military and economic strength, integrating the defense sector with civilian research and manufacturing, and government agencies, both national and international, with private firms and universities. And if you look, for example, at the PLA guidelines on hybrid warfare, it's striking how much they focus on controlling public opinion and on psychological campaigns and the exploitation of legal frameworks, as well as coercive military diplomacy in areas like the South China Sea. So I'm going to pause there. I think that we have a lot yet to understand, but also we have quite a large task ahead of us in reshaping our own understanding of risk and our own understanding of security to deal with what is a profound systemic competition. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Isabel, thank you very much indeed. That was very interesting. I'd like to turn to David Shimer. Perhaps, David, you can make your contribution as well. Last but not least.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks to you both for starting this off in such a fascinating way. I think the discussions about China and Russia are different in many respects, one of which has to do with the objectives of each state. I think what we're hearing so far is that the Chinese objective is to offer a model that is more compelling than America's to the world, to surpass America, to strengthen itself in various respects in order to outcompete America. I think the Russian objective is quite different. I think the Russian objective is to tear down democratic states, to corrupt democratic states, to perhaps, as one would say, get down in the mud in order to weaken and subvert, because Russia is unable to surpass viably in the many different domains we're talking about countries like America in any sort of traditional way. And I think that is a marked departure from the Soviet period, when the Soviet idea was, we are going to, beat America. We are going to show the world that our model is better. And I don't think, I think anyone who says that Vladimir Putin's aim is to engage in that sort of struggle with the United States is missing the point. I don't think Vladimir Putin is seeking to recreate the Soviet Union and reestablish control over half of Europe or the equivalent. I don't think that Vladimir Putin has an ideology. I think that Vladimir Putin believes he's engaged in a power struggle, not an ideological struggle with the West. And that from his perspective, if he can tear down and weaken other states, he's winning. If he can divide democracies, both in terms of their relations with one another and in terms of actually subverting the functions of a democracy, he's winning, because he can both show his own people that, see, the democratic model doesn't actually work. and I may be in power for longer than I said I would be, or there may be rampant corruption in our state, but at least we have order. And these other countries, they not only don't have order, they don't have progress, they don't have a future, they don't even have a process of succession that works, which is much of what his electoral operations are about, taking away the idea that democracies facilitate progress, because if you don't have a democratic process of succession in which people believe in democracies, that really strikes at the heart of what it means to be a functioning democracy. And so in terms of understanding what Russia is after, I also think it's important to look at Russia's assets. Because as has been discussed, Russia's military is substantially smaller in budget than America's, for example. But Russia does, for example, have a lot of nuclear weapons, but Russia can't really use its nuclear weapons. And the Russian economy is not able to compete with America's economy or China's economy. So what Russia's left with, and what's quite formidable, is Russia's intelligence services. And I do believe that when we try to understand Russia's actions in the world, we should not underestimate Russia's abilities to cause chaos and to cause trouble and to manipulate states, because Russian intelligence is very skilled. And it just happens to be that in the 21st century, in 2020, whether Russia has as many aircraft carriers as we do at this precise moment doesn't matter that much. And I would actually make the argument that America, in some ways, is still in a 20th century mentality of spending the extraordinary amounts that it does in its annual military budget, whereas China especially, but in some ways Russia, are investing in much more worthwhile ventures at this present moment. The competition I think America's in right now is in trying to prove that its democracy works, and that American democracy is still a viable alternative to this neo-authoritarian model. And in that sense, dollars would be much better spent in investing in our own, speaking as an American, in our own country, in domestic priorities, in showing that, our country is not just a dysfunctional hotbed of hate. And I think in readjusting toward that new mentality, recognizing what Russia is after, which is to degrade, disrupt, and discredit the democratic model, that doesn't call for a new Cold War. That calls for helping democracies renew themselves, and also making sure that our own democracy is a functioning democracy, and not just one that purports to be. That's how I view the Russian objective abroad. In terms of the Russian experience at home, I do think it's also important to understand Vladimir Putin as an individual who came up with the KGB, which is often invoked, but it actually does matter recently, because he's a trained intelligence officer who came up with an agency, for example. We talk a lot about election interference, who came up with an agency that interfered in elections all over the world in competition with the CIA. That was the case for decades. He came up with an agency in which he was trained to subvert and manipulate, to read and understand people. Those are skills that remain extraordinarily pertinent to our present moment. He also someone who was based in Dresden at the end of the Cold War, and saw a very stable state collapse in an instant. And he recalls very vividly later the helplessness he felt and the frustration he felt as those protests overtook the East German state. He's someone who has expressed immense resentment of American action in places like the former Yugoslavia, in Iraq, in Libya, where seemingly strong men with control over their states like Slobodan Milosevic and Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein fell very quickly, of which he holds immense resentment, and he said so. He is also someone who feels very similarly about popular revolutions in Ukraine in 2004. In the Orange Revolution, and again in Ukraine in 2014 when Yanukovych fell, in Russia in 2011 where there were massive protests voiced partially or supported partially rhetorically by the United States and specifically Hillary Clinton. These are things that he takes very personally and that he views as its own type of intervention, and that he believes could topple his own regime, because again, he is someone who came into power saying that he would be president for 8 years. He's now on track to serve for more than 3 decades, and he has enriched himself. It's impossible to know by how much, at least, has been said in an open source sense. But some folks say that he's the richest person in the world. So when you look at that kind of person and that kind of regime, you're A, trying to maintain your power at home. You're B, trying to diminish the appeal of competing models that could lead to some sort of color revolution in the streets of Moscow. And you're C, seeking to diminish your democratic rivals, and you're seeking to divide them from one another. And that's why you see Russian support for Donald Trump, for movements like, although the evidence here remains extremely unclear, Brexit, like interference in democracies all over the world, from Ukraine to Montenegro to Colombia, trying to just divide and degrade democratic governments, to corrupt them from within and to divide them from one another. So I believe this challenge is very different than China. I think China is much more long-term. I think the Russian challenge is right in front of us, and is something that matters, that is ongoing, that we need to take seriously, but also has to be viewed as much more of an effort to defend against sabotage rather than to surpass an ascending state. I think those are two very different discussions. And I think that with China, America should be playing along. The democratic world should be playing along. With Russia, I think the democratic world, especially America, needs to get its act together and formulate an actual policy response to defend its democratic sovereignty, to deter Russian subversion and aggression, especially in the cyber domain, and to come up with some sort of strategy to defend its process of succession and its information environment more generally. And I can talk more about how I believe we should be doing that. But again, I think to group, therefore, China and Russia together, other than the fact that they're both key foreign policy challenges, would muddy the waters in ways that are unhelpful, because I think they are very different challenges in terms of both their objectives and their long-term strategies.
David, thank you. Well, that was fascinating stuff from all three, as we not only hoped but expected. What we'd like to do now is have a discussion to further look at some of the points that have been raised, and I will, as it were, facilitate, if I may. But it's going to be a freewheeling affair, I hope. One thing that struck me, which came out on several occasions, and indeed in all of your comments, was this idea that both Russia and China were seeking some form of acceptance which they perceived they had not had in the past. Russia, because of the speed with which the Warsaw Pact collapsed and the Soviet Union collapsed, in a sense, and this interesting point that Isabel articulated, that the nationalistic atmosphere of the Chinese government is underpinned by a sense of victimhood and grievance, and only the party can actually bring the nation from this. I think most of us, if we didn't put the tag of Russia and China on it, would see, if we were looking at an opponent, this as a weakness. And I just wondered whether it was ultimately a weakness. I am particularly concerned in the military, in more general matters, that we spend a lot of time looking at our own weaknesses and highlighting the strengths of our opponent, and we seldom look intently enough at exactly what our opponent doesn't want us to do to them because they fear it. And I wondered whether this was a potential weakness within China and Russia.
Briefly, I think, yes, you're right. It is a weakness. It's a weakness that is rather hard to escape. Just a little more on where this narrative came from. It very much it becomes institutionalized and embedded in Chinese discourse after 1989, and of course we all know what happened in 1989, and that was the moment when it became very difficult for the party to represent itself unequivocally as the party of the people once the People's Liberation Army had moved against middle-class young people demanding a different sort of China. So another story was required. And at that point, you begin to see the construction, for example, of dozens of anti-Japanese museums. You start to see public memorialization of episodes from the 19th century, from the period of China's weakness, the weakness of the Qing dynasty, and the arrival of foreign colonial powers in China. A classic example is the old summer palace, which the Yuanmingyuan in northwest Beijing, which was burned down, a rather extreme episode, by the British and the French. That for many, many years was simply a few curiously shaped stones and decorative items in the middle of agricultural land in Beijing's northwest suburb. But after 1989, it is then rehabilitated as a site of national humiliation. China even has a day of national humiliation as a memorial day to kind of hammer home the fact that the outside world is hostile, that China was the world's greatest power until brought to its knees by the outside world, and therefore you need the party forever. I mean, that's a very crude way of representing it, but it's a pretty crude approach. Now, the weakness of that, to go back to your question, is that you can't always get off that tiger. The Chinese expression, he who rides a tiger finds it difficult to dismount. And there have been episodes when, for example, anti-Japanese sentiment has got pretty out of control in China. So China has on occasion turned it on, but then found it quite hard to turn off. And what it does mean in terms of its relations with the outside world is that there's a really growing imperative to stifle international criticism, plus the growing need to demonstrate strength at home. And that narrows the negotiating frame quite considerably. So China can find itself trapped into a rigid posture when actually flexibility is required. And the need to demonstrate strength at home is that can be a real problem in terms of outcomes. I absolutely agree with David that China's ambitions are very different from Russia's, in that China does need still a stable and relatively welcoming world, because China still depends very heavily on this huge network of trading relationships and financial relationships. It's really not ready to become an autochthonous economy, even where that's possible. So it doesn't want to bring the world crashing about its ears. But it's a very fine line that the party has to walk between this more aggressive posture, more assertive posture, and maintaining relatively stable relations. And actually, in the first 6 months of this year, we can see how easily that line can be crossed. And I don't think anyone would regard the last 6 months as a success for China in terms of its diplomacy. It now has far more hostility and pushback around the world than I have seen in decades. And I don't think that was intended. I think that was simply overreach, overconfidence, and letting the domestic priority drive the foreign posture in a way that was unhelpful in the end.
Anthony, yeah.
I think that one point I would make is that yes, there is a serious political and ideological competition. There also is a very serious military competition, and how much that tracks with ideological concerns is really, I think, questionable. Another set of events occurred that influenced both Russia and China. That was what happened in 1991, and oddly enough, in the Iraq War. From Chinese perceptions, it was very clear, and it led to major shifts in their defense structure, their emphasis on their defense industrial base, that the kind of warfare that the U.S. was beginning to use, that brought down Saddam Hussein, which was an early form of multi-domain warfare, had fundamentally changed the balance. meant that a good part of China's military structure was obsolete, and meant that if China did confront the U.S., its position was a great deal weaker than I think it felt. And that showed up in a lot of Chinese military literature, not so much in the white papers, which, quite frankly, have gotten vaguer and vaguer with each passing paper. So you had that springboard, and out of that came a whole set of different forms of competition. I also think that in the case of Russia, we may be underestimating the degree to which it feels it can exploit Europe. Frankly, one great problem with our president's emphasis on burden sharing is its total irrelevance to any aspect of defense. But on the other hand, this is a NATO idea, and essentially it is a European concept imposed on a military organization, which focuses on spending regardless of what you buy and regardless of what the end results are. Again, there is absolutely no correlation between whether you meet NATO goals and whether you are buying effective forces. And I think you're seeing a little of that in Great Britain right now. Really, a carrier task force to the Pacific, that's the natural priority? Or what on earth are Germany and France actually doing? And a European defense concept, if you look at it country by country, you begin to realize that Russia sees real windows of opportunity, and it's exploited them also in areas like Syria, Libya, and yes, the U.S. is certainly at fault as well. I think that we have to look at this as a broader range of competition. From an American viewpoint, remember that you have to simultaneously develop forces to deal with China in Asia, Russia in Europe, with what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in the rest of Asia, now Africa and Latin America. So we can't separate China from Russia. Europe perhaps can and should. I'm not quite sure that Europe can't play a major economic role, but when we are having to lift French forces into Africa, it's a little hard to believe that France is going to be playing much of a role in the Pacific. And Germany, I think, is way off that. I think, too, that the issue that you raised about the industrial base in Europe, oddly enough, I think we may be doing even worse in the United States. We called in the new strategy for a look at the U.S. industrial base and its defense role, and also by technology areas to emphasize. When you actually try to figure out where we reached any conclusions about what to spend and what to do, we had these 4 speeches by cabinet level or senior U.S. officials over the last month, and all of them talk about the opponent, and none of them talk about changes in U.S. behavior. So this is an area where I think we really have major problems. The issue, I think, that David raised in terms of disinformation, which is a critical one and I think perfectly valid. I think it's only one of the Russian initiatives, but the one thing I would say about it is, here, if you look at what the U.S. has done at a more classified level, I think we have prepared much better than this particular president has been able to allow anyone to react to. And it is a basic issue in terms of technology, and here it very directly does interact with China. Multi-domain warfare isn't platform warfare. It's as much space, electronic, information warfare as all the rest. And both Russia and China here are much closer together than is sometimes apparent. I think the problem we have is this is an area where far too much of the US and European activity is overclassified, where there is very little open source detailed analysis of technical capabilities that is comparative or net assessment. And that is a broad problem in the West's approach. When you talk about vulnerabilities, how can we have an alliance which never actually compares NATO capabilities to those of Russia? Or where you basically have a China military power document in the United States, which is a reasonable intelligence projection, but the closest thing I have seen to a real analysis of Russia is done by a Swedish defense research group, not anyone within the European or NATO community, and the US hasn't touched the issue officially since 2017.
Yeah, I think that all makes sense to me. I guess a few thoughts occur as to not overestimating a few things. And in terms of your initial prompt about sort of whether Russia wants to be welcomed or accepted, I don't think that's so at all. I think that was so in the Yeltsin period. I think that Boris Yeltsin wanted to be a part of the G7 and to make it the G8. I think that Boris Yeltsin wanted multi-billion-dollar loans from Western institutions. I think that Boris Yeltsin derived his power from his relationships with the West. I think Vladimir Putin's regime is very different in that regard. I think it's almost opposite. I think that he wants to derive his own power from his leadership as a foil of the West, and I think B, that from his worldview, and this date predates him, this goes back to the Soviet period, it's in his interest to tear apart international institutions. Because if you think about the world from Russia's perspective, or at least Europe and the United States, if European states are all banded together under the umbrella of the EU, then Russia's dealing with the EU, let's say economically. But if the EU didn't exist and Russia were dealing with each state individually, from Russia's perspective of just zero sum, who is more powerful than whom, Russia would have more leverage and more influence if each state was sort of on its own. And I also think we shouldn't overestimate the importance right now of an organization like NATO, which in my opinion is woefully behind in terms of the nature of conflict with especially Russia today, where if a Russian tank rolls into Estonia, we're obliged to go to war, which is fine. But if Russian hackers strike at the heart of Estonian democracy, which is its elections, or for that matter, at the heart of American democracy, which is its elections, nothing happens. There is no response. There is no unified defense. There is no collective deterrent. It's as though when we talk about, and this is the last thing I don't think we should be overestimating, the military. We could be spending $700+ billion a year on our military budget, and yet Russian military intelligence is systemically penetrating our electoral infrastructure, manipulating tens of millions of Americans in covert ways, basically showing that our democracy is powerless to defend itself. And again, no response. So when we talk about 21st century warfare, I think that there is a trap, which is that if we just spend more money on the military, or if we beat out Russia and China in our military spending, they spend $60 billion, so we're going to spend $900 billion or some whatever it is. I think Russia likes that. I think that's fine, because from Russia's perspective, if we're putting money in our military, we're not putting money in things like education that would actually help our country defend itself on a citizen level. We're not investing in our infrastructure. We're not investing in building a better democracy. We're just have a bigger military, but we're still divided, we're still dysfunctional, and we're still so easy to exploit and manipulate. So and that I think is true writ large. Where something I was struck in my research, I interviewed I had the chance to interview heads of intelligence services and presidents and intelligence officers all over Europe, in Latin America. And every democracy I went to is under siege by Russian intelligence. And they're being undermined. They're having discord sown in their societies, and they're having their societies, if Russia has its way, transformed from within, so that Russia never fires a shot, no tanks ever roll, but suddenly you have rather isolationist, nationalist, closed, authoritarian models, quote unquote, democracies who are suddenly much more aligned with Russia, who are expanding Russia's influence abroad. And again, this has nothing to do with tanks, planes, and ships. So I do think that when we consider what Russia's after here, it's quite clever and it's quite subtle. It's over time to draw states toward its orbit and its model, away from the international institutions that have underlied American power in the post-war period. And by the way, we now have an American president who at least was helped to get elected by Russian intelligence, who himself is against many of these international institutions and is against many of our traditional alliances with these democracies. So I think the military, it matters, but I also think that there's this line between foreign and domestic policy that I find so prevalent in so much discourse is really missing the point here, because if we are investing in ourselves as a democracy, that helps to counteract the objectives of our adversaries. So this line that somehow if you are, again, like let's say investing in digital literacy and in your education system, that should be a national security objective, because that's making it so your state is less easily undermined and manipulated. So that's how I view what Russia is after. I think that Russia has no intention of invading Western Europe. I think that Russia just wants to build states or manipulate states so that those states in Europe align more with the Russian state, and align with Putin's vision for the world. And again, because for him, this is what it comes down to, shows to his own people, I'm powerful, I'm legit, I can undermine big states like America, we can ally with states like Poland or like Hungary, and they have governments like mine, and therefore you should want governments like mine because those are the governments that actually function well and have strong, legitimate leaders who are tough and who stand up for traditional Judeo-Christian values. So that's how I see this current conflict, and for at least for me, I'm less concerned about tanks rolling into Estonia, but maybe I'm wrong there, and we'll hear news about that front soon.
I just want to redirect the conversation, if I may, really into or back to a sort of domestic point. In all this extraordinarily complex these extraordinarily complex international relationships, and the complex aims and to a degree opaque aims of countries like Russia and China, how does a global Britain fit? What role should we in this country be taking in support of the United States, or not in support of the United States? What are the feelings there?
I mean, based on what I study, I think that Britain has just as much of a role to play with America in many respects. In terms of the subversive activities of Russia, I think Britain was woefully caught off guard in terms of the activities of Russian intelligence, in terms of the security of its elections and its information environment generally. I interviewed the head of GCHQ, who was running the agency in 2016, and he said it was a failure on his part that they had no idea that Russia might seek to manipulate the Brexit referendum, and that he regrets how ill-prepared they were for Russia's modern digital campaign of political subversion. So I think the first thing Britain can be doing from a Russian perspective is figuring out ways to shore up its election security, and to really tackle many of the challenges America is seeking to tackle right now, which is how do you hold an election as free as possible of foreign influence in this new digital world. It's a very complicated question, and I think that Britain can be leading the way in terms of finding a viable policy solution to that challenge. I think that Britain should be working with America as well as other democracies in seeking to come together to form a unified front, again, in this digital world of how do we stand up to Russia? How do we deter Russian aggression? How do we make it so that the cost that Russia knows will be imposed on it for its bad behavior outweigh the perceived benefits? I think that is not something that any democracy can do on its own. I think our strength here is our collective unity, as has been the case in the past, and I think that Britain should be, again, at the forefront of that. I think transparency is important. I think it was a real shame how long it took for the Russia report to be released. I think that if we're going to actually build a policy, a credible solution to the Russia challenge, there needs to be as much information available as quickly as possible in terms of attribution, in terms of the actual magnitude of the threat, so we don't overestimate it or we don't underestimate it. And I think secrecy is a real problem here because this is such a people-oriented threat. What Russia does is manipulate people, manipulate voters, manipulate citizens, and therefore voters and citizens should be made as well aware as possible of what Russia's doing and how. Otherwise, we're flying blind. So I think there's much that Britain can and should be doing to play a role in pushing back against Russia. And I think to date, as in America, there's been too much oversight. There's been too slow of a reaction. There's been too little transparency, and there's been too little recognition of sort of the continuous and also global nature of this threat. And I think adjusting for those misjudgments and responding in kind in a unified and multilateral way would be a really helpful thing for Britain to do.
Isabel?
Yes, I certainly agree with that. I would go back to the earlier question of attending to our own deficiencies. You know, when the Huawei discussion was very active, as I suppose it still is, but looking at the balance of risks, what GCHQ would say was that, yes, of course, Huawei is not a trusted vendor, but security on the network depends on having at least 3 suppliers. And we have allowed our capacity in that regard to simply to be driven out of business by China. We need to attend to our own deficiencies because we need to recognize that the kind of competition that we're in with China goes across the spectrum, and it's unlikely to be a military competition. What else could Britain do? Well, if you look at what the sort of preparation that China has put in place globally, you see, for example, China setting up alternative and parallel diplomatic entities. So it has set up, for example, a rival to the Mekong River Commission, which is now functioning far more effectively than the Mekong River Commission did. Why does that matter? Because China has enormous interests in hydroelectric power and in regional energy. Now, we let that happen. China, with 17+1, tried to weaken the European Union. That went less well, frankly, because China really didn't deliver on the promise that many of the members of the that many of the members of 16 and then 17+1 thought would come to them. So its influence has not particularly grown. In Latin America, there are parallel diplomatic arrangements that China has set up, from which the US and Canada are excluded. So you look across this spectrum of influence building, and I think that Britain has a strong diplomatic tradition, and Britain ought to be persuading the United States not to turn its back on the multilateral order to the degree that it has appeared to, and to begin to combat China's influence intelligently in these institutions. That would, for example, require attention to China's efforts to set the global standards for the next generations of technologies. And that is a direct and strategic question that Europe, the UK, and the United States are all going to have to face. And again, it's been an area of neglect. I think there are many aspects of British foreign policy that have simply been asleep at the wheel over the past decade. And it's time that we return to those skills, which I see as more effective and more intelligently focused than sending an aircraft carrier east of Suez.
Anthony?
I think I find myself somewhat less pessimistic about the impact of Russia on elections. I think it is a very real issue. It is important to note that it is also an area where, at least in the U.S., it is essentially the intelligence agencies and the related military groups that can gather and fully manipulate and counter that data, although in theory much more of it could be done at the civilian level. I think, though, when you talk about global in Britain, the problem is, like some of the American strategy slogans, what on earth does any of that mean? A strategy that does not have a plan and a budget is not a strategy. It is sort of an intellectual vacuum with reassurances. And I think the very word global should be a warning. A power the size of Britain can do a great deal more if it focuses. And it deals in the areas that both David and Isabel have raised that are nearby, where there is both a combination of industrial issues, economic issues, which to some extent Britain has rejected. And at least someone should probably say that Brexit might not have been the brightest idea in the strategic history of the Western world. But I think it is also true that if Britain is to deal with these issues, it has to deal with them both with the U.S. and Europe. Here, the cooperation gets to be critical, and multi-domain warfare, in theory, would do this. But here, David's point about transparency is critical. When you look at both the British reports and the American reports, they are remarkably hollow compared to the amount of information people actually had. And there is a tradition of overclassification, of not having transparency, of not focusing on actual decisions that lead to actual activities that bothers me a great deal. So to be perfectly honest, Mark, one of the things you might consider doing is just taking a large red marker and slashing out the word global, and then asking people, fine, now you had Brexit, what are you actually going to do? Where is the money really going to go? Do you have any actual plan for allocating resources other than simply maintaining, and here I have to agree with David, platform traditions? The fleet probably isn't quite that relevant anymore. I'm not sure I can tell anyone in Britain what to do, but I think I can suggest what not to do. And that's to issue hollow slogans without having a plan, without taking actions to implement it, and without showing the public where you're going.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you, our other two participants, David and Isabel, for your contributions to a fascinating discussion. I would now like to turn to Lady Pauline Neville-Jones for some concluding thoughts on our discussions today.
Democracies have a reputation for being slow off the mark. They like to believe that the rule of law will prevail, because if it does not, costs are involved. Hitler got a long way before the threat he represented to the security and the values of European neighbours was recognised. So listening to our three interlocutors, one could be forgiven for concluding that the same thing is happening again. The analysis is that the climate of international relations has gradually deteriorated since the fall of the Soviet Union and the heyday of globalization in the first few years of the new millennium, and that it is evident from both Russian and Chinese policies that this decline has not been by accident, and that Western democracies, especially Europeans and the United States, have had their eye off the ball. And while political leaders are now beginning to respond, our speakers evidently think that not enough, and not enough of the right things, are being done. Well, I agree. I also agree that Russia and China present different challenges. Russia is in fact a declining power, not really able to compete with either China or the West, and that under Putin it has chosen the path of confrontation rather than cooperation with its neighbours and democracies, seeking to sabotage and undermine countries it has cast as opponents. It's hard to know how to turn this situation around, and the immediate task has to be to prevent its success. This is partly a military task, and NATO comes in for some criticism from our speakers for its focus on burden sharing rather than on producing relevant capability, but it is at least as much about increasing domestic awareness of the attempt to corrupt our institutions and to ensure their resilience, a goal not aided by the tendency of governments to keep secret the evidence of attack. Another podcast could focus on what, to my mind, is a difficult policy area, since government protection of free speech and free association is liable to become a contradiction in terms. But much the greater challenge is China, and China's primary strength is economic, commercial and, I would say, technological. Her manufacturing prowess has in part been built on Western offshoring, and it is now inconvenient to break supply chains into which China has been integrated. Greater Western awareness of dependence on China comes at a time when the Communist Party leadership have adopted an increasingly hard and assertive line, both domestically and abroad. Harmonious rise, with which we used to hear, has disappeared. But as our speakers point out, the results for China recently have been mixed. In a society where revealing inconvenient truths is penalised, reputationally damaging cover-ups are bound to occur, as with COVID-19. The ambition of total internal control has brought with it harsh external policy rigidity. Will either or neither of these related behaviours give ground? As things stand, there is no Western consensus on how to manage the relationship with China, and nothing which could claim to be called a strategy. One can safely say that the relationship is no longer moving forward, but are we going to allow the move into a bipolar world to take place without any attempt at arresting the slide? The question is how far, in the name of national security, will supply chains be disrupted? How far will policies designed to control investment by China in the West be taken? How far will policies designed to control investment by China in Western companies and technologies be taken? Will scientific collaboration become a thing of the past? Will China continue on its increasingly overbearing path, inciting further hostile Western response? If so, the losses are all round, economic and political, will be huge. Increasing confrontation in the South China Sea carries dangers of major conflict. Our speakers are sounding a wake-up call to democracies, and I would like to see the old transatlantic allies have a go at formulating a joint strategy which incorporates something of the twin-track approach of the Cold War, where confrontation was resisted and cooperation rewarded. Is this a possible initiative for the UK, with the G standing, as it should, for Great Britain?